Well, first of all, welcome to the first event of 2021 for Global Strategy Forum. Today's session is entitled After the 2020 Election, the Challenges for the United States. This, I hope, will take the form of a conversation where we'll cover a number of areas, culminating in last Wednesday's inauguration of Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president. We've got quite a lot of interesting areas to cover, and we've got some very interesting people to cover them. So if I can start by introducing our two speakers, our two experts today. First of all, Sir David Manning, who was the British ambassador to the United States from 2003 to 2007. And secondly, the Right Honourable Jack Straw, who was the Secretary of State for Justice from 2007 to 2010, Foreign Secretary from 2010 to 2006, when I had the honour and privilege of shadowing him. And then he was Home Secretary from 1997 to 2001. So I think without more ado, I think we'll start the conversation. First of all, David and Jack, warm welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think there are three key areas that I can see I think we might try and sort of use as a basis for the conversation. Firstly, the legacy of the Trump years and the Trump effect in general, because we can't ignore the fact that 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, and looking at the effects of that in the longer term, I think is important. Secondly, the challenges both at home and abroad which face President Biden, and these are quite considerable when you look at not only just the pandemic, but also what China is doing, what Russia is doing. There are a number of areas we can usefully explore there. And then finally, the implications that the new administration will have for the relationship between the United Kingdom and the US, particularly following Brexit. During the course of this, I think we'll have a general and wide-ranging and, I hope, thought-provoking discussion. I wanted to start by saying that the sight of last Wednesday's inauguration, without the crowds massing the Mall and the Capitol, and with much of downtown DC effectively a military fortress, it was one of the most extraordinary scenes I've seen in my lifetime. The impact of the pandemic on American life and the extraordinary levels of security in places after the Capitol riots were clear for all to see. But equally extraordinary was the total absence of the outgoing president, which was again counter to normal convention. The end of a tumultuous 4 years in the White House was marked by Donald Trump still alleging fraud and refusing to concede that he was defeated, departing for Florida in the last flight on Air Force One before Joe Biden's inauguration, when he would no longer have been able to do so. So there was quite a sort of farcical element to it as well. It was left in the end to poor old Vice President Mike Pence to attend, and through his presence to be part of the handover from one administration to the other. But I'd like to, first of all, start, and I'll start, if I may, with you, Jack, and then ask David if you'll follow on from there. What was your assessment of Donald Trump's 4 years in office? And how do you think history will remember him? What will be his legacy? Well, I mean, there's all obvious areas, such as the appointment of 3 Supreme Court judges, which will have a long-term effect, or could have. And all these are things which I think it's a good moment now to reflect on them and to see where we think it'll take us. So, as I say, Jack, would you like to start on that?
I'll give it a go. I mean, none of us are Trump supporters. I mean, the first thing I'd say that there was a reason why Trump got elected in 2016. Okay, he made all sorts of wild allegations against Hillary Clinton, which were very effective, suggesting she run a separate email system in the State Department, which was against the law, and all that stuff. Very crude allegations made against her and suggestions that she should be locked up. But behind that, there was something more serious going on, which we've also seen here, and I think was reflected in the Brexit vote in that same year, which was an alienation in a sort of Brechtian sense of a significant proportion of the electorate from, if you like, the establishment. I mean, Trump called it the Washington swamp. But here, whatever side of the political divide one is on here, one had to be aware that there is, particularly amongst white working class men in both countries, this strong sense that they have been left behind and that the system is no longer for them. And when somebody comes along and blames the other, which is what Trump was doing, that was very potent. And one of you mentioned, Michael, that 74 million people voted for Trump, and indeed they did. And all of us know people who voted for Trump. Most of them are not mad, malign, or bad, but they just did not feel that the traditional party system was properly representing them. And we may think they're wrong, I do, but we can't take away those feelings. And of course, behind them, there is a smaller group of people who really are mad and bad, who've signed into Trump's very mendacious view of the world, that he's been some kind of conspiracy. So that's the first thing, and that legacy, I think, will continue. And the greatest challenge that Joe Biden and the Democrats have is not further to alienate that group, those who are, as it were, open not to be alienated. Trump did get the economy in the US really steaming. I mean, you may disagree again, as I do, with the methods he chose. But if you look at until the pandemic hit, the American economy was really doing very well, and unemployment had dropped. And personally, I think that he was right to turn to China and to call out the fact that China had misused its position within the World Trade Organization to not to work on a, as it were, level playing field, but to tilt it very much in China's favor. So I think those are things which Biden needs to follow, to take account of. I mean, on the other side of that, it's extremely unpleasant, basically racist approach to members of Muslim countries, to breaking up immigrant families and so on, just horrible. And there's a sort of brutality about his politics. So, I think, and that kind of point is going to take quite a long time to remove from the system. But Dave is really the expert. I mean, he lived there for 4 years and followed America.
Well, David, can I, but just before you come in, broaden it slightly, listening to what Jack was saying? One of the things which struck me was the feeling, and it was partly in the language one heard, that the 74 million in some way were reflecting the division in America which has existed since the Civil War. And I wonder whether you want to say something about that.
Yes, well, thank you, Michael. I think it is a dreadful legacy, to go back to your original question. And there are good reasons why Trump was elected, and Jack has spoken very eloquently about that. But I think it's a dreadful legacy on various levels. He has polarized America and played to its divisions over the last 4 years, really ruthlessly. Jack touched on the racist issue, but Trump has at no stage in the last 4 years tried to bring America together. And he's tried to exploit those divisions throughout his period in office, and indeed to get re-elected. So he leaves behind, I think, a very polarized country, and a country that is going to be difficult for Biden to put back together again. Although, as Jack said, there were many strains and stresses before Trump arrived. I think he also leaves a very difficult legacy for the United States internationally. America has gone missing in terms of global leadership. And it's not only gone missing, it's become an embarrassment to its partners and allies. and therefore the sigh of relief around the world, at least among democracies, when Joe Biden took office, was palpable. And the job for Joe Biden is to rebuild the multilateral approach that the United States has adopted in international relations until Trump. Indeed, it fashioned the international system, and to put the world back on a more even keel. And that is a huge job, and another part of the Trump legacy. I think the third thing I would say is that Trump has done the idea of democracy enormous damage. He has been a gift to the authoritarians, to those who mock the democratic system, who see it as unable to deliver, as unfair. And so, the propagandists in Beijing and Moscow have had a field day. And to discover a president who apparently has nicer things to say about authoritarian leaders than about his traditional allies, it has been quite extraordinary. And so rebuilding belief in the democratic system, in its fairness, in the fact that we can act together multilaterally, that we do share common values, is again, I think, an enormous task that Joe Biden has. I mean, I would say that I'm more optimistic than some. I don't for a moment want to diminish the task that he's got, or to pretend that the long shadow of Trump, and I'm sure we'll get into this, isn't going to make his life very difficult over the next 4 years. But he is an extraordinary man, I think. It's easy to underestimate him. He's been in politics in America for 40 years or more. He's been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's been vice president. He knows everybody around the world. He knows all the issues domestically. And he is naturally someone who reaches out. He doesn't bear grudges. And he has now, almost uniquely in Washington, got a track record of trying to work across the aisle, as they say, trying to work with opponents on the other side of the political divide. And I just think if anybody can try to promote this healing process at home and to reach out again internationally and give American leadership, he is a very good choice. It's very hard to think of anybody else who might be able to do that. I think the other thing I would say on the legacy issue, Michael, is the terrible ravages of untackled COVID that have been left by Trump, which makes Biden's task now, I think, essentially a domestic one, certainly in the early months, getting a grip on the pandemic, trying to re-inject some life into the stuttering economy. And those are things that, again, he's going to have to do and are much worse than they might have been if Trump hadn't been president.
Do either of you think that impeaching him is a good idea, looking to the future and how you bring people together, or do you think it's going to be divisive?
So I've thought about this a lot and also discussed it with American friends who are in the system. I can see why the Democrats in Congress have chosen to do this, but I think it's really risky. And I think that if I were in that position, as it were, in Congress, or particularly in the House of Representatives, I think I probably would have argued in the caucus against it. And there are, I think, two related risks. One is that there'll be a trial and it gives Donald Trump a chance to try and exonerate himself and say, well, this wasn't me and I opposed it and all the rest of it. But the second is that there's quite a lot of opinion in the US, including an op-ed in yesterday's Washington Post, which happens to be co-authored by a friend of ours, both of whom are Democrat lawyers, who said there is no constitutional basis for a former president to be impeached after he's left office, that the articles of the Constitution make it very clear that the purpose of impeachment is to remove somebody from office who can't do the job. And it's also, they say, pretty clear that the framers of the Constitution intended that if there was to be any criminal prosecution against a former president, that would happen in the courts afterwards. And bear in mind that whilst a serving president can't himself be subject to criminal proceedings whilst he's president. And their view, which they say was in the Washington Post yesterday in an op-ed, was that whatever, as it were, the merits of what Trump did or didn't do, and we all have the view that it was absolutely outrageous what he did in inciting a riot, even if the Senate decides to impeach Trump, this is going to end up in the courts, and the chances are that the courts will overturn the decision. So I think it will turn out to be a huge distraction. The last point is my general view of situations in politics is if your opponents are in trouble, it's often better to let their problems fester. And I can think of a number of occasions, one of which I was involved in, but famously the Westland issue in 1986 in the UK, where the shadow cabinet came to the view that what we had to do is to have as it were, to drive the knife in this case against Margaret Thatcher. And it turned out to be, a disaster, but not for Margaret Thatcher, but for the Labour Party. So I think that's the view I would take.
David, you got anything view on it?
Well, I agree with Jack that I think this is a very difficult call. On the merits, it seems to me there is no doubt that he should be impeached. When you have the president who is supposed to be the ultimate defense of the Constitution, actually assaulting the constitutional system of the United States and encouraging an insurgent mob to sack the Capitol, which results in 6 people dead, it seems to me that this is an act of such enormity that if the system wants to defend itself, it needs to show that it's taken action and that this is absolutely unacceptable. On the other hand, as Jack says, it will now be a distraction. President Biden wants the Congress to do a whole lot of other things rather than spend a lot of time on impeachment. And I think the likelihood of Trump actually being impeached is rather slim. So there's the calculation, does he actually benefit from this when he can turn around and say, there you are, they tried twice to impeach me and they failed. And it just goes to show that, you see, I'm the victim of the Democrats and the left-wing socialists and communists in this country, which is the line I expect him to take. I find it difficult myself, though, to adopt a position where nothing should happen. I don't know if it's legally possible. I think now it would be better for the Congress to pass a law saying that Trump can never hold public office again, rather than get into the pros and cons of impeachment. Whether that is feasible, I'm simply not enough of an expert to say. I would just add, though, that I think one result of impeachment will be to split the Republican Party. And that may be something that in the longer run is in the Democrats' interest, and indeed in the interests of the American system. I mean, what happens to the Republican Party now seems to me to be critical to whether two-party democracy in America is going to recover its health and flourish in the future. If this party is just going to become a Trump movement and the traditional Republicans are going to be squeezed out, then it's a very different prospect, a very dark prospect, I think, for American politics. And the fact that at least a few congressmen and senators have now broken with Trump suggests that there will have to be a real debate about whether the Republican Party is going to break free of Trump, or whether it is actually simply has become his pawn. And perhaps this trial, this impeachment, will at least show where the cleavages are in the Republican Party and those who are willing to defend the system and those who aren't.
Yeah, the European Council on Foreign Relations this week warned that America, and I quote, have a new president but not a new country. And Mark Sedwill, Lord Sedwill, who both of you know very well, said basically the same thing himself in the Times towards the end of the week. I think this is an interesting point, because if we're looking to the future, where America's going, do you see, starting with you, David, that the Republican Party can revive, or are we going to see another party on the right of American politics, or are we going to see a Trump party, for that matter?
I don't know the answers to that, Michael. I think if I were Trump, I would threaten another party, but not do it. setting up a third party is always difficult. And even if he is much more successful than, say, the Ross Perot's and of the past, people who've tried to go independent, it is an enormous task. And at least some Republicans will peel away, some of the traditional Republican Party. So he might have an awful lot of people behind him, but whether that would ever translate into more than a kind of third party spoiling role, I'm skeptical. I suspect that he will threaten to do it in order to try and maintain a grip over the Republican Party. He has a lot of the Republican Party funds in his bank account, and he is obviously bringing pressure to bear on Republicans who have opposed him, threatening them with, as we would call it, deselection in their seats and so on. So my hunch is that he will try to maintain a grip over the Republican Party. But it's very hard to know, and he will presumably decide, in the light of the outcome of the impeachment trial, what is his best option. I mean, I would say to this point about, America hasn't changed. I'm sure that's right, and I do agree with Mark. But the 6th of January was an extraordinary day, not just for this appalling insurrection and this assault on the Capitol, but it also gave us a glimpse of an alternative America when Georgia, in the deep South, a traditional southern state of America, for the first time elected both a black senator and a Jewish senator, something that would have been, frankly, inconceivable when I was ambassador in Washington 15 years ago. So I think, there are alternative Americas. Perhaps that's the problem. It's, how do you bring them together? But the idea that you could have a result like this in the deep South of America goes to show that, it's not just the Trumpian vision of America that we should focus on, although that is black and, in my view, and very difficult. But there is another much lighter vision that is possible. And perhaps Biden is going to be able to encourage that and to forge links between these two alternative universes that are at war in America at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wasn't aware of this conclusion of the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU, and I'm not sure it's a correct one. And therefore, I'm sorry to say I disagree with Mark Sedwill as well, for whom I got very high regard. And it's for this reason. I mean, first of all, when you get a change of president, particularly with a change of party, that itself can change the nature of a society, not immediately. And secondly, picking up David's point, January the 6th was unbelievably shocking, and not just shocking for America's friends around the world, but shocking for the American people as well. And that was palpable from what an awful lot of decent Republican lawmakers themselves said. And the fact that these hooligans were running around the Capitol shouting insults and threats against Republicans who weren't on side illustrates I think the degree to which the 6th of January will be seen as a bit of a break point in American politics. And I'd also just say this, Michael, going back to my first point. We see this here, for example, with Margaret Thatcher's election or with Tony Blair's. I mean, not the day after, but leaders who've got a clear vision can change what the electorates think, not by brainwashing them, but by example and message. And I think that Biden can do that. And in a sense, January the 6th gives him a great base on which to build, to say to most decent Republicans, you can't possibly want this for your party. And it's actually not in the interest of the Democrats for the other party to be shifted, obviously, towards Trump. So I think that things can change. And there have been plenty of examples in the history of countries where you've had really pernicious movements of the kind that Trump has led, which after a while, because they are unsuccessful, do fade. And the optimistic side of me suggests that might happen.
Looking at this, I wonder whether you feel that Biden's first task and major task is going to be reconciliation domestically, and that if that is the case, foreign affairs is going to take rather a back seat during this early period, and what the implications of that are.
I think reconciliation is his prime target and his primary objective. And I thought his moving speech during the inauguration shows just how much he sees himself as attempting to heal the divisions and reforge some sense of unity among Americans in very different groups. So I'm sure that is the priority. And in fact, unless he has some measure of success doing that, all his other tasks become much more difficult, I think. And like Jack, I'm not unoptimistic about it. I don't for a moment suggest it's going to be easy. But I think after America's arguably near-death experience with democracy under Trump, an awful lot of people may pause and think that what the new president is saying has a lot of merit to it, whether or not they necessarily agree with his policies. But I'm sure domestic priorities will come first, whether it's COVID, whether it's the state of the democracy in America, whether it's the economy. But it's also true, I think, and it's certainly, I think, the view of the people around Biden, whom I've spoken to, that domestic policy is very often foreign policy. And it's quite difficult to make this distinction. It's very hard to do anything about pandemics if you're treating it simply as a national problem. It is one of Biden's huge priorities to do something about climate change and sustainability, which you certainly can't do just by sitting at home. He's passionate about human rights. That's not just a racial and ethnic issue in America. That's a global issue, which is going to be very uncomfortable for countries like China and Russia. So I think although he must concentrate on getting his house in order at home, otherwise nothing else is going to prosper, it is inevitable that he will have to be very much involved in international issues. And they do ambush you. I mean, goodness me, as both of you having been ministers, you will know better than anybody how the best laid plans tend to come unstuck because, events get in the way. And who knows what will test Biden and his administration early on. So thinking that you can, as it were, put foreign policy and international issues to one side, I think would be a big mistake. On that, I would just add, Michael, that I think he's got an extraordinarily talented group of people around him to cope with those issues. One of the dreadful things about Trump, and this is part of his legacy, is to have hollowed out government institutions and government ministries to an extent where certainly my contacts in Washington were saying things were barely working. In comes President Biden with an immensely impressive team of people, including John Kerry doing, the whole question of climate change. I'm sure we'll get onto that. So he's got some very clever people working for him, watching out for for his international back, while he is busy focused on domestic issues.
Yes, I agree with what David has said, and just to add, I mean, it may well be, Michael, that in terms of the hours that President Biden spends each day, many more will be spent on domestic issues, certainly in the short term. But David's absolutely right about the really distinguished team of very experienced people Biden has appointed, and people who were used to working with Biden, and Tony Blinken as the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan as a National Security Advisor. Really interesting appointment. Bill Burns, who's been one of the most distinguished US diplomats, an Arabist, knows the Middle East and Iran inside out. He's now director of the CIA. So they've got this team. And I think provided Biden is clear about what he wants from those people, he's in a position of being able to trust them to get on with the job and come to him when they need direction. And it's a very different circumstance from Trump, where Trump trusted nobody, including many of the people he appointed, wasn't willing to listen to them. chaos was the consequence.
Can I move this slightly more specifically to some of the things which he is facing? For instance, the JCPOA. Where do you think he's going to go on that, and what are going to be the ramifications, for instance, for his Middle East policy?
Well, my guess is that he's already going on it. I mean, I happen to see a summary of the Iranian press every day, in English, not Farsi, just had. There is great debate in Iran, inevitably between the hardliners, who brackets are the people who most benefited from Trump's maximum pressure policy against Iran. It's impoverished a lot more Iranians, for sure. It's made for all sorts of difficulties. But there was a kind of Faustian pact between Trump and the right-wing Republicans who and Netanyahu, led it was said, who wanted nothing to do with the JCPOA, and the hardliners in the Iranian system, who themselves always opposed the JCPOA for a whole series of reasons. So, but there are those, including Rouhani and Zarif, and some others in the more hardline section, who are saying, yes, we've got to talk. In any case, they actually know they've got to talk. My guess is that already there will have been feelers out to the Iranians through probably, I don't know this at all for certain, but probably through the route that they used before, which was using the Omanis as honest brokers. And bear in mind that there were 2 years of secret contacts, actually partly led by John Kerry when he was in the Senate, and the Iranians, well before the formal negotiations restarted when Rouhani became president. So that's my guess. And then there's the issue of, well, what's in the deal? I mean, what the Iranians are, and they know it's naive, are saying they just want the deal re-established and for sanctions to be lifted and for the things to go back to where they were. That's not possible because life has moved on in the intervening 3.5 years since Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. And the Iranians too, I'm afraid, have been continuing to be more disruptive in their neighborhood. Now, personally, I don't think that it's going to be possible to have a negotiation with Iran where you have their nuclear capability plus the neighborhood plus missiles all in the same basket. But those matters have got to be discussed. And then I think if we're lucky, there'll be a sort of iterative deal where the Iranians will get something and the Americans will get something and so on. But the great news is that Biden is committed to going back into the P5+1, which is critical for its success, and with luck, making it having a JCPOA Mark II.
David, where do you think he will move first on climate change? I mean, you've got the Glasgow conference coming up in November. Do you think he'll use that as a major staging point for his policy?
Yes, I think he will. And I think he's already moved in the sense, Michael, that he's taken the United States back into the Paris Climate Accords and made a very high-profile point of doing that on his first day in office. So there is no doubt whatever about his commitment to this. And I'm sure that he will try to establish in the next few weeks, national targets and priorities. He will hope that those can be used as an example to others, and he will take those to the Glasgow Climate Conference in December. He's got an enormously powerful advocate in Kerry, who will be very busy, very active, is a true believer. And I think that, the United States is really going to be back in a big way on the whole climate change and sustainability agenda. And he will see that as something that is, I think, both very important to him personally, but as a signature policy of his administration. So I think we will find that this is very, very high up on his agenda wherever he goes and whomever he speaks to. It's rather lucky for us. I mean, we haven't got on to the question of the UK-US bilateral relationship, but it's lucky for us because here is something that we can immediately engage with the new administration on. And we come to this relationship now with some baggage, so it's not necessarily the easiest transition. But here is an issue on which we do see absolutely eye to eye, and where we will be hosting an enormously important climate change conference, which, thank goodness, is going to have a Biden administration present at it and not a Trump one.
Can we turn to what you were just mentioning, the UK-US relationship? David, where do you think that is going to take us now? I mean, we've heard, back of the queue arguments from Biden's predecessor as a Democrat, and we've heard that he made his first telephone call to our Prime Minister. Where do you think we stand in terms of that relationship?
Well, I'm much more relaxed about it, Michael, than some, especially some of the more excited commentary about it. Look, there's baggage, there's no doubt. There is the fundamental difference that Joe Biden thought it was a big mistake for Britain to leave the EU. He said so, and he regrets the fact we've gone because he wanted our voice at the table in Brussels. But we have gone, and that is done. There have also been some unfortunate things said across the Atlantic about the Prime Minister and perhaps by the Prime Minister about others in America. But as I said at the beginning of this discussion, I don't think Biden is somebody who bears grudges. He will look forward. He won't be looking back. And ultimately, what is going to count is actions, not words. And we are lucky in that we have now in Biden a president who's actually much better for British interests than Trump ever was. He believes in the multilateral agenda we believe in. We just discussed the whole question of climate change. His views are going to be very close to ours. And it ought to be perfectly possible for us around our presidency of the G7 in June and around our chairmanship of the COP26 climate change conference in December to build all sorts of bridges with this new administration and adapt very similar policies. So I think that we will find that there are all sorts of reasons why the UK and the US will work comfortably together with the Biden team. There are differences of personality. There are historical issues. That is all true. We will be diminished in the eyes of the foreign policy establishment in Washington because we have left the EU, and we will be having to work harder to get our voice heard in Washington. But we are lucky that we have these summits in the UK, and we are lucky that we have a president who won't recriminate and who will see, I think, many of the big issues from climate to pandemics to managing China to dealing with Russia very much in the same way as we do.
Now we're going to just turn it slightly, given you were Defence Secretary at one moment, to the sort of defence side of things and NATO and where we got to with Trump and where we might move now. Do you think this is going to be a strong link between the United States and the United Kingdom?
I mean, sorry, I was Foreign Secretary. I was never Defence Secretary.
Foreign Secretary, sorry, yes.
Yeah. But, well, defence is, yeah, for sure. Membership of NATO and the fact that unlike almost all our European partners, we are making the 2% contribution to defence spending. And along with France, are really the only European country which has troops in any number, not sufficient, but troops in any number who can be inserted into conflicts with some confidence. That makes a difference, and it's on the defence and intelligence and security, Michael. As you know, there's been the closest continuing relationship between the US and the UK, and we can build on that. Like David, I mean, I too deeply sad that we left the European Union, but we can't re-engage that argument. And there are also, but nor should we think this all going to be a disaster. And the Americans are never going to want to talk to us and see the Europeans as a natural ally. We will see them on some issues as natural allies more than us. But there are other issues, particularly handling China and Russia, where there's a greater potential gulf between the Biden administration and European countries, particularly Germany, than there is at all with us, because China is such a critical market for German goods, particularly motor vehicles and many others. I read a couple of days ago that the Volkswagen factory in Shanghai produces more vehicles than Volkswagen makes in Europe, and makes a high contribution to Volkswagen's profit. So that they're really caught there, if you like. And then on Russia, where even within the Christian Democrats and the CSU in Germany, they're frankly all over the place about how they handle Russia, again because their strong economic links and this critical issue of Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that is the Germans and the Russians have signed up to building, which will also be a bit of a source. So it's not just going to be plain sailing for the Europeans. And we have, because with luck, we might be maintaining and building up our understanding of what's going on in Europe, even if we're not part of it. We may be able to assist the Americans in their endeavours there.
David, what's your view on that?
Yes, I think the defence and intelligence relationship will remain very strong, Michael. I think, as Jack has pointed out, we do get to the 2% of GDP in defence spending, which is a target that is very important to the Americans. It precedes Trump. It was something that Obama pressed for. It was something that we were warned and have been warned as Europeans over 10, 15, 20 years that we must do better. And so I don't think Joe Biden is going to give anybody in Europe a free pass, anybody in NATO a free pass over defence expenditure. And we shouldn't just assume because we're so relieved that we lost Trump that it's all plain sailing, as Jack said. I think the fact that the European Union has signed up to a trade deal with China in the very early days of the Biden administration is not something that's gone unnoticed among those around Biden, who had hoped that they might pause and have a discussion about a wider relationship with China before the EU did that. So I think managing China is potentially something that is going to be very important in the transatlantic relationship and possibly quite contentious. And it will need careful diplomacy to make that work. I think on Russia, it's just worth adding that the people around Biden are very expert on Iran, and they're also very expert on Russia. Bill Burns, who's now, as Jack said, he's one of their most distinguished diplomats, has now been made head of the CIA. He was also ambassador in Moscow. And there are decisions there for the Biden administration to take, which are quite tricky, because on the one hand, they do want to extend the New START arms control agreement with Russia. It's the last big strategic arms deal that exists anymore. On the other hand, there's no doubt Biden is not going to be quiet on human rights in the way that Trump was and didn't care what went on human rights. And at the same time that the new administration wants to extend the START deal, it finds itself presented with this emerging crisis over Navalny and the whole question of human rights in Russia. So trying to find ways of both engaging Russia and at the same time maintaining clear policies on issues like human rights is going to be one of the tasks that the new administration faces. It's certainly the same with China, with all the issues over the question of so-called genocide in Xinjiang, what's going on in Hong Kong, the threat to Taiwan, and so on. And one of the problems that this administration is going to have is how does it find ways of cooperating and competing at the same time? That is an issue that we all face too, and in theory, it ought to be possible, I think, for Western countries to sit down together and work out how to fashion common policies towards China and Russia. But it is interesting that Tony Blinken, in his testimony in front of the Congress when he was appearing before them before he was confirmed, said that the Biden attitude to China was to outcompete it. This is, in a sense, saying, okay, well, we'll take you on the economic issues, on the artificial intelligence issues, on all of that, and we'll win. It's I think, a slightly different way of looking at the challenge from China from the outgoing administration, which was much more inclined to take China on by using sanctions, by building up armed forces and so on. So I think we can expect a more multilateral approach and a more competitive approach to China, at the same time looking for ways of cooperating on things like climate, pandemics, and so on.
Where there are these divisions between Europe and America, what role do you think we should be playing in terms of reconciling them or finding a balance between them?
Well, I think we should try, and I think we should do it with realism. We know the players all very well, but at the current moment we have a rather bruised relationship with many of our European partners, and we also have to establish our credentials with the incoming administration. And some of them have regarded, perhaps they were talking loosely about British leadership as sort of neo-Trumpian. I think we're past that stage already. There's been a good conversation between the Prime Minister and the President, but we shouldn't exaggerate what we can do. I think what we have got going for us, Michael, is that we are key players in NATO, which is a key forum for this, and we do have the chairmanship of the G7 this year. So if we are clever, I think, and are energetic about using these two fora, we ought to be able to help promote a much more cooperative relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic, and to engage the Biden team on the issues we've been discussing.
Yes, Michael, brief. I agree with David. When we were members of the European Union, we really could do a good deal to help, and I had experience of talking to Condi Rice and Colin Powell before that about issues which were coming up in the Foreign Affairs Council, and trying to assist in bringing the two sides together, which was sometimes tricky, but we often succeeded. Now that's not available anymore. It's just one of the consequences of many of Brexit, and there we go. But as David said, there is NATO, and I think that it's in our interests to ensure that we play an even more active role in NATO, including the level at which ministers attend the Parliamentary Assembly, which has tended to be a bit of a backwater for British parliamentarians and so on. And it can't be an alternative to membership of the European Union, but it can to some extent be a substitute. So there are those things. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, yes, Boris Johnson was excruciatingly too close to Trump, certainly in the early days, and it was I sort of result from it. Most of us, I think, did. However, thank God, the successive Conservative administrations, including that under Boris Johnson, have stuck to the Biden policy, if you like, on climate change, and stuck to the Biden policy on Iran and many other things. So they didn't buy into the totality of Trump's agenda.
Might be worth adding, Michael, that there's a possibility, it seems to me, though I'm not an expert in this, that we can work more closely with this administration on international development aid. It's striking that President Biden has appointed Samantha Power to be head of USAID, which is the equivalent of our aid administration. And she's enormously energetic and highly regarded, and will have enormous influence inside the system. And I do wonder whether there are scope for us to work more closely with the United States on aid issues around the world, maybe through the United Nations, maybe bilaterally. We need to think about those sorts of dimensions, the sort of soft power dimensions of Britain around the world, and see where those might coincide with what the Biden administration is doing as well.
Can I just end up with one brief question, because it's been talked about so much over the last few years. What are the chances of getting a trade deal, do you think, with the US now?
Well, I think they have receded. I don't think they're nil. It's not the priority for the incoming administration to do trade deals. I think if a deal can be done reasonably easily, they will do it. But I don't think they're going to put it to the front of the queue. But I'm a bit of perhaps I take a minority view on this, Michael. I don't even think it's very important. I think that the government made the mistake of making a great, the sort of touchstone of the bilateral relationship, and it was going to be one of the great compensations for leaving the EU. In fact, our economic and investment and trade relationship with the United States is on a huge scale already. I think it's still true that we're the biggest investors in each other's countries. And certainly when I've seen people do the trade maths, even if we get this deal, it's going to make very little difference to how we do our trade and investment, and certainly isn't going to compensate for the damage that we're going to do to our EU trade. I don't think it matters terribly much. I think the relationship can flourish economically and commercially without it. I worry, actually, that once we sit down, we will get back into lots of rows about chlorine-washed chicken and pharmaceuticals, and that this will tend to obscure the fact that the relationship goes on perfectly well without the FTA. So, I mean, if it were me, I would be much lower profile about it and much more relaxed about it. But I think, as we see from presumably the briefing out of the conversation of the weekend between the Prime Minister and the President, that's not the view number 10 take.
Last quick point. I agree with David, and that there's people here don't understand how much negotiation a trade deal requires in the US between the administration and Congress. It's different from here. Okay, so negotiators in the UK have to take account of parliamentary concerns, but ultimately they can sign the deal and live with the consequences later. That's different from the US. You're suddenly inserted into this cauldron of US interest groups. So, I mean, chlorinated chicken is a famous example. Plenty of others where individual lawmakers are going to be watching like hawks that their interests of their districts are not going to be affected. So, like David, I think, well, is this really worth the candle? And certainly not make it a priority.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time, but Jack, I apologize for having accused you of being Defence Secretary. You were Secretary of State for most other things, I think.
That's all right.
But it's been a really interesting conversation. We could have gone on for a lot longer, but I'm really grateful to you for coming in and taking part in this, both of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.